Hello, and welcome to this installment of the Future Grind podcast. I'm your host, Ryan O'Shea, and today I'll be speaking with JJ Hastings. JJ is a biohacker, artist, and researcher, consistently blurring the line between art and science. She's a graduate of NYU, Harvard, Oxford, and London's St. Martin's with advanced degrees in biology, fine art, and bioinformatics. She's been a biohacker for over a decade, and her artwork has been exhibited around the world. In recent years, JJ has turned much of her attention to analog space missions, through which she conducts social, psychological, and scientific experiments that will pave the way for human missions to Mars and beyond. We discuss her Manifesto of Transfiguration, the relationship between art and science, hackers in space, and much more. As always, show notes and links are available at futuregrind.org. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever podcasts are found. A video version of this episode is posted on Facebook and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review to let us know that you're listening. If you'd like to keep this podcast running, you can donate at futuregrind.org/support or make a purchase at futuregrind.org/store. We are still offering the opportunity to send your digital files and photos to the surface of the moon on board Astrobotic's first lunar mission. To find out more and to get involved, visit futuregrind.org/moon. That's futuregrind.org/moon. Because of you, this is Future Grind. Right, and now we are here with JJ. JJ, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I already gave a brief introduction for you, but you have so much going on that it's difficult to condense it all into something that concisely explains what you do. So I'll give you an opportunity to do that instead.
Okay.
How would you describe what your focus is and what it is that you do?
So you're absolutely right. I have trouble describing who I am and what I do to others. Others have no idea how to describe me. So I think the best way to succinctly sum up my sort of frame of mind and what I do is that I'm an extremophile in every regard. I pursue extreme ideas, extreme spaces, extreme things. So I've just kind of called myself an extremophile, and that kind of just shapes what I do in so many different ways.
So what does that extremophile lifestyle look like? And what is it that you think interests you about extremes?
So for me, it's mundanity that kind of is the killer of all things. So I try and avoid mundanity in any way, shape, or form I can. So it manifests itself in ways like going to Antarctica, which I did just in February. But I didn't just go to Antarctica. I sailed on an early 20th century ship. The ship itself was built 3 years before Shackleton ever headed off to the Antarctic continent. It means going to distant places like the lava tubes, down into lava tubes on the side of a volcano in Hawaii to look for fellow extremophiles, microflora that love atypical terrestrial conditions. Or, as a fellow hacker, I love doing extreme things with my body. I love challenging what's possible with my body. I think it's imperative that we engage with our bodies as not something that's sacrosanct and perfect, but rather something that can always be played with, just as we play with other things.
So we're going to explore everything you mentioned there in more detail, but let's start with the hacking that you talked about. You've been referred to as a biohacker, but that word has a lot of different meanings. So when you use that term, how are you defining it?
Yeah, I understand. There have been multiple attempts to kind of claim that word biohacker, and others have described me as a biohacker. Sometimes I describe myself as a biohacker. some in the community that claim that title or that domain are interested in improving or enhancing their own bodies. In my mind, it's a matter of playfulness. I'm interested in one, transparency. So one is a bit of advocacy in science for openness, transparency, understanding that knowledge needs to be shared, distributed, and otherwise tested. But the other is a playfulness with my body and with the biological world. So hacking is a practice, that can extend into many different domains. So biohacking is just kind of the word that's emerged for using the practice of hacking within the biological domain.
So we've already touched upon all the diversity of things that you've done in your professional life, but I'm interested in what got you on that path in the first place. So what was your early life like, and how did you get interested in the things that you are now pursuing?
Right. So I was on track from a fairly early age to be a tried and true academic scientist. Went off to grad school in the 2000s at Harvard, studied standard, genomics, went off to Oxford and studied bioinformatics when it wasn't even really a thing yet. I think I started studying bioinformatics in 2007 when it was barely any scripts out there. And no one was really considering it yet because we didn't really have much data. It was really early days. But really what got me into biohacking, so as the practice and really becoming involved in it, was when I became really sick. So I had to leave behind that academic career for a bit and essentially become a girl in a bubble because I was my body was so compromised, I really couldn't leave the house. So I had to be taken care of full time. And what that meant was I really had to look inward in so many different ways in terms of what it meant to be a scientist, what it means to have a body. And for me, discovering that body could fail me in almost like a self-betrayal. And then looking outward then, and finding this community of other people that were interested in subverting, in a way, with the best of intentions, subverting this sort of hierarchical, antiquated, heavily influenced by the Industrial Revolution and then the militarization of science into the 20th century. This community of people around the world that were really passionate about claiming science and biological science research for themselves. And that really was the sort of transformation for me around 2009 was when it started for me. And I built my first home lab at home in 2009. And then really started to connect with some of my amazing colleagues that were starting to build community labs thereafter.
So I totally understand if not, but would you be open to discussing a bit more about that illness and how it changed the path that you were on?
I think I'd rather not go into the absolute details of it other than to say it was autoimmune in nature. It meant that my body was essentially eating itself away, still is, and having to, I wouldn't say confront, but really more come to terms with the limitations of what my doctors were suggesting, which were extremely harsh treatments, really harsh biological and chemotherapeutic treatments that were really damaging my body. And I don't want to sound like I'm some sort of homeopathic, alternate medicine practitioner, but because I still very much believe in the strength of truly scientifically proven medical therapeutics, but more realizing that I shouldn't just take a one-size-fits-all approach to what was happening with my body, that I really had to take ownership over what was going on and pay careful attention to what was happening in my body versus what my doctors were saying the average body with my condition should be experiencing. So I think that was kind of a turning point for me in 2009, 2010.
And were you aware of the biohacking movement and DIY movements before this, or was it through this process that you discovered it?
It was actually through this process. Becoming ill, it provided another opportunity to look a bit outward. It wasn't just my concern. It was looking outward and discovering that there are a whole new emerging community worldwide that we're seeing that it's possible to get secondhand equipment and want to sort of fulfill all their scientific dreams and ambitions, even though they can't get access to a lab. That really inspired me.
You have a short manifesto published on your website titled The Manifesto of Transfiguration. And while it's brief, only 220 words, it contains a lot of what I see as powerful, but also controversial statements and observations. I'm going to ask a bit more about this, but before we get to that, would you be up for reading this manifesto so that our audience can get a sense of it?
Sure, we'll see if I can read it without tripping over my own words. Here it is. Nature, and by extension the human body, is mediocre and deserving of scorn. It is not the product of supernatural design, but rather probability, and therefore merits no intrinsic reverence or devotion. The schism between natural and synthetic is artifice. Whether made by the hands of humankind or other beings or forces, all matter is formed of the same fragmentary constituents of our cosmos. As a species, humans have developed an impulse to find meaning out of seeming disorder, and from this impulse is born our search for purpose and the transcendental. Such an impulse can be destructive as much as it is powerful, yet it must be cultivated in the search for our own apotheosis. It is only through the advancement of techne that apotheosis can be attained. For what is technology but an attempt to ameliorate insufficiency? The quest for apotheosis merits abhorrence for the ordinary and aversion to convention. Rather, our deliverance lies in the singular, the aberration, the improbable. Uniformity brings mundanity, the perdition from which we seek salvation. Transcendence must be sought in every aspect of our existence: the material, the spiritual, the cerebral, and the emotional. And that which is revered as sacred, sublime, and worthy of devotion must abjure a sense of familiarity. Ours is an aesthetic devoted to the exceptional, the irrational, the preposterous.
Thank you for reading that. I'm going to link to it in the show notes as well, because I'm sure my audience is going to want to read it again and study it further. So can you talk a bit about the genesis of this and what might have inspired some of it?
Sure. So this is coming at a time where I was really starting to take, ownership over, the direction of my own body, and started really, this came right at the inflection of where I was really deeply engaging with my own biomaterial. I've used my own body in so many different ways, removed different material, everything from my internal organs, including my small intestine and stomach, to work with as material for my artwork and scientific practice at home, to my blood, to skin, to muscle, and of course the usual other bodily fluids that emerge. So in my mind, this was an attempt to say, look, the body is not sacred in and of itself. It's not made perfect from the outset. It is what it is. And it's up to us to really decide how we're meant to engage with it for ourselves. That was kind of the origin of this, was how are we to engage with our own bodies? And for me, it was the manifesto was written at a time when I started to work with my bodily material to create artwork. So that was the sort of genesis of this.
I'm definitely going to ask more about this art as well. And I see that this is dated 2014.
Yeah.
How do you think it's aged since then? And do you still stand by it? And do you see it as a living document that might change, or is this its final form?
Oh, I hope it changes. I hope I don't ever stay stagnant. This, to me, is a time capsule. It's a moment where I was coming to a sort of revelation myself of my own beliefs of how I should engage with my own body and seek my own meaning by engaging with my body in a new and different way, where it's not something to be fixed according to a medical standard, but rather something that I can really start to determine what its form can be.
There's a section here, quote, "The schism between natural and synthetic is artifice. Whether made by the hands of humankind or other beings, forces, all matter is formed of the same fragmentary constituents of our cosmos." This line seems to say that there's no real difference between what exists naturally and what humans create. And I think I agree with that. But you've already established at the beginning that you feel that nature is mediocre and deserving of scorn.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if there's no difference between the natural and what humans make, would you by extension say that all of our creations are likewise mediocre and deserving of scorn?
That's a great way to parse my words for me, and a great reflection, great mirror back. I think what I was trying to be intentionally provocative in that very first statement. Really, what I'm trying to respond to is this romanticism, especially what I was experiencing at that time when I was living in London. Europe has this focus on the natural world as being romantic, very reminiscent of the sort of response that you saw in the art and cultural world. During the Industrial Revolution, you had this group of artists that were like, "Oh God, the industrial world is so awful and disastrous. We need to, preserve nature, and nature is perfect. Where we humans are destroying it." Well, it's so for me, it was a response to that renewed romanticism of nature as being something intrinsically perfect and humans as just having this innate disastrous turn when they touch nature. So that again was, it has to be contextualized in the time that I was writing it and the place where I was writing it. When I talk about that artifice that separates natural and synthetic, to me, it represents a very deep schism that we tend to place ourselves as separate from the technologies that we create, as separate from nature, which I think tends to lead us on that disastrous turn, that the romanticists are trying to remind us of. It's insisting that we center ourselves amongst everything else, whether we create it or something or some other being or force creates it, that we are just part of this creative force that's ongoing. So I think that's what I was trying to get to in that separation.
Got it. And I can see this manifesto fitting quite well into some of your artwork, which you have described as an appropriation of laboratory techniques or data for the purpose of creating artwork. And you've already mentioned that you use parts of your body literally in the artwork. Can you talk a bit more about that and what that consists of?
Right. So early on as an artist, I was interested in the self, not self kind of dichotomy that's set up, at least in sort of Western narratives. I kind of was exploring this idea that I called xenopoiesis or strange making. When I remove blood or some other part of my body and turn it into or make it a part of artwork, so it's not really recognizable as being part of my body. Some artists, remove blood and they want it to look like blood. In my case, I'm interested in how I can push that material so that it is not quite recognizable as being from my body, and yet you can trace its material connection to where it came from. So that was earlier on, and that was about the time that I wrote this manifesto of how I can transform something that was part of my body into something externalized. Can it have a separate life, an identity of its own, or does it always maintain some sort of connection to me? That was something I was exploring then. Now I'm interested in machine learning, particularly. So that's been the focus. I did my PhD at the University of Melbourne, wrapped that up, thank God, right when the pandemic time was coming on, where I was interested in machine learning, but particularly sort of machine creative agents and agency. What does it mean for a machine that has some sort of agency? And I like exploring what we mean by agency, what it might think when reflected back at me. So at the sort of core of this wonderful discourse around machine learning and machine agents and agency is what data we are collecting, how it's being labeled, categorized, stored, accessed, all this wonderful debate over how that's done and how it's collected, especially. But then how we consider the outcome of the training of those machine agents. So my recent artwork over the past 2-3 years is focused on the data that comes from my body compared to the data that is pervasive and available publicly, specifically genome data. So I had my genome sequenced in 2016, whole genome sequence. It was 80-fold coverage, so comparatively high fidelity, and then programmed a few different algorithms to look at that genome and compare it to other publicly available data, including some of the ways that that data had already been sort of sorted, categorized, and labeled. So one of the first machine agents, creative agents that I programmed was something called the demiurge. And if you're a fan of Greek literature like I am, like the Hesiodic cosmogonies, and the demiurge was this demigod that essentially created things out of the universe. It wasn't a completely transcendental god. It was a demigod that essentially was a maker, to put it into our kind of community parlance. Maker took what was there in the universe and made the things, made the world. And so the demiurge that I programmed took what was available publicly of human genomes and then reflected back to me what it thought of my genome and the different bugs, and I put it into machine parlance, the different bugs and errors that it would find, and it would tell me how to fix it using a module that I'd given it to give me instructions on how to fix it using CRISPR. Now, mind you, CRISPR was all the rage at this time. I can also use other vectors to fix it. But I was more interested in what this machine agent would think based on what it knew from the public medical domain of my genome and what I needed to fix about it to make it, quote, perfect. And then the second sort of machine agent that's kind of emerged out into the art world is Phanes, which was also a protogonos that was born in an egg and was androgynous, so has no real gender. But Phanes, I had my eggs frozen, so I was curious. Oh, and I'll also mention I draw a lot of inspiration from nature because I think we take for granted. I wish we all studied the natural world a bit more as students and really engaged with it, because there are amazing ways in which nature kind of intersects and mixes together in different ways. So there's a species in the Midwest of salamander, the ambystoma. There's a species of salamander that are all female clones. And they walk around, and when it's time to procreate, they have their own eggs, and they walk around and kind of collect spermatophores, so these little pockets or packets of sperm that their cousin species of salamander have left behind, the males of the species. They kind of pick up those packets and repurpose them, take little bits of their genetic material, and construct their own daughter clones. So they share some mitochondrial DNA between the mothers, but yeah, they kind of are they call them kleptosexuals, which kind of is rude because they're not stealing anything. Their cousin species, the male cousin species, have just left their sperm around, but they've created these bricolage, these mixture genomes. So using that as kind of inspiration, I was interested in how Phanes would construct using the 8 oocytes that I have. So we've got my genome in there, my chromosomes that can be used, and what other genomic material would Phanes, based on the demiurge, how would it create sort of, and I'm saying in air quotes because this is the real point of the artwork, this perfect generation of new female daughter clones that are based on my genome. So my artwork is meant to kind of use myself as the experimental case because it's a little easier for me to work with my own body without having to ask others for consent. But at the root, what my artwork is attempting to do is show what's possible with our current technology, start the conversation around what's possible, and then hopefully engage in some real critical discussion of what we can do, maybe should be doing, and being reflective on the ways that we're considering ourselves to be perfect, imperfect, or reconsidering what we consider family. Because the salamander, trying to draw the family tree of ambystoma salamander, is it's a maddening effort.
So this is all extremely interesting. And I think one of the things that initially strikes me about this is that you are describing all of this as art or artwork. But I could imagine someone describing the same things, or at least components of them, and framing it as though it's science and not art. Do you see any distinction between the two? Does it perhaps depend on the intent of the creator of the work, or is it perhaps in the eye of the beholder? How do you view this?
I think you've hit on a really important part. And I think for anyone that has deep experience, like personal experience of working in creating art or performing scientific research, even social research, I think those who are familiar with the practice of each of these different methodologies that go into the discipline or field would say there's very little difference between them. There is a huge difference, however, in who we're talking to about the things that we are researching. So if we're talking to scientists, or speaking within the context of science, we're talking about shared truths, shared experience in a different kind of way, ways that we try and quantify. If I'm speaking within the art domain, I'm interested in discussion, in culture making, maybe thinking through the problems that we all share socially. So I think it's quite a bit to do, I think, like what you were hinting at, the eye of the beholder, but more which audience am I facing? If I'm talking to scientists about what I do, absolutely, I'm using the tools of science. They function. It actually works. It's not speculative. But am I trying to say that this needs to be applied all around or should be a shared truth? I don't think so. So I think very much when we think about art, science, social science, or any other kind of research or methodologies, we do have to think about the intent of performing it and who we're speaking to about the work itself. I can speak to scientists about the technical aspects of the work, my fellow computational biologists about the technical aspects of creating the program itself, of creating the creative agent, and the data scientists in terms of the data that I've created and how it was classified, labeled, and then propagated throughout the algorithm. But and I can talk to biologists about how how we might actually transfect human oocytes with exogenous synthetic chromosomes that are made in silico. So we can speak about it in scientific terms, but we can also speak about it in cultural, artistic, or in other terms.
When it comes to this distinction between science and art, I often think of how the differences in framing can lead to differences in acceptability and public perception. For example, we can look at someone like Stelarc, a performance artist who has engineered and constructed an ear on his forearm. This required multiple surgeries and was a feat of science, technology, and engineering, but he framed it all as art. And I think that made it more acceptable. If instead he framed himself as a scientist or as a guinea pig for science and portrayed this as advancing medicine or making scientific discoveries, I think that this may have been viewed as unethical and unacceptable and would have been rejected. So I wonder what freedoms and abilities one might gain simply by calling something art rather than science. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Oh gosh, yeah. I think that's a wonderful example. So Stelarc is a very dear friend, and I admire the hell out of him. In fact, he is very responsible for helping shape my very early ideas on science and art. So I think you're absolutely spot on. If he were to have done this, as a scientist and said, "Well, see, this is my work. I've implanted my own scaffold into my arm, and I'm trying to show you that it is totally possible for this to not be rejected and to create a, totally reconstructible ear." It probably would be problematic only because a scientist has been taught in recent times, and this again traces back to around the time of the Industrial Revolution, that you need to have objectivity. And this term objectivity actually emerges around the time of the Industrial Revolution. It's a great book on objectivity written by Lorraine Dostin and Peter Gallison. It's a thick tome, but it talks about the emergence of especially microscopy and some of the technologies that were developed in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and how they lead to our current notions of objectivity in science. For a scientist to say, see, I've done this to my own body, that notion of objectivity is dissolved. And so contemporary scientists would say, well, you're way too biased. There's no possible way we can use this as any scientific basis of reality. Earlier scientists probably would not have the same sort of qualms. Like, oh, wonderful. Okay, let's try this again, maybe with someone else. So the way in which we kind of accept scientific attempts, especially self-experimentation in science, have dramatically shifted from the 18th and 19th and even 20th century. Yet we still have wonderful examples of self-experimentation leading to amazing discoveries.
There was an artwork called Bennu that you described in one of your talks. And essentially, Bennu is ash made from your own blood that can now be an ingredient or a component of something new. You've described Bennu as marking, quote, the beginning of a planned obsolescence of my own body and its rebirth into new incarnations. What do you mean by this? And what do you think these incarnations could consist of?
So this was about the time of that era of xenopoiesis, of strange making. What I think I was also responding to is this, and I particularly see this in biohacking, a fixation on immortality as, a singular being, right? Or maintaining memories. And in my mind, that really focuses on something rather abstract and difficult. We tend to neglect the rest of the body, right? That somehow our self is centered in our mind and our memories. Rather, I was interested in, and still am interested in, this planned obsolescence. Instead of trying to preserve this body as one thing in a singular state, as if I was still a 20-year-old, how can I think about preserving the body and the memories that it are held throughout the entire body, our entire material memory that's contained within every cell? How can I think about transforming that into a memory that's left behind, some sort of trace? So that was the beginning of Bennu and marking time, and even translating my DNA into other material things. So inserting my DNA code into other objects, both in terms of the data, but then also materially inserting the DNA into different other objects and creatures. So in my mind, it's meant to be more of a response to this idea of longevity and immortality being preserved in the singular being, and instead kind of planning the obsolescence of that one singular being and transforming it into many different things. So I've made all sorts of other materials using my blood in particular, including glass and glazes and ash and pigment and so many other materials, that it's really an experiment in how to create a sense of immortality that is not quite what's being kind of passed around, especially in the biohacking scene.
So there's a word that, at least in my view, seems to be thematically present in your work and the discussion around your work, but that I don't hear being directly said. And that word is transhumanism. Mm-hmm. Is this what appears to me to be an avoidance of this term intentional? And what are your thoughts on transhumanism?
So I think I've seen transhumanism, kind of like the word biohacking, kind of co-opted for specific reasons, right? So absolutely, I'm interested in transhumanist ideals. Absolutely, Max Moore and Natasha Vita-Moore have had some, early impact on my thoughts around what it means to be human, post-human, or whatever other entity. But I don't necessarily want to classify myself as a transhumanist, because I think that also kind of places me in alignment specifically with just transhumanism, because I think my ideas are a bit more fluid than that. mostly because of these focuses or these ideas that tend to come along with it around immortality and the way in which we preserve the body that I don't quite agree with.
And you have some implants as well. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Look, it's just the standard, subdermal XNTs, the NFC implants that most people have. I'm really wanting to put in a peg leg. I absolutely adore Michael and the crew that have been putting together the peg leg. So really keen to do that. I'm interested in doing all sorts of different implants. I'm really quite open and free with what I would do. So please, if anyone's out there listening, please do get in contact. I'd love to do different neural implants. I'd love to do any sort of modification to my body. It's really more a matter of finding time for it. I love doing temporary modifications. So inserting electrodes. Stelarc and I have talked about this, how to do temporary modifications to control the body. He's done this through external instruments in his Stickman project. I'm interested in doing it through implanting electrodes, just through needles that can conduct energy into specific muscles and having machines rather than humans control those actions. I'm quite open to all sorts of different play with my body.
So, where do you do this bioart and biohacking work? I imagine the places you work in are less art studio and more science lab. And I understand you've worked to form a couple of community biospaces, including Biomakerspace in London and Bioquisitive in Australia. And you also had the first PC1 certified home lab in Australia, which was in your garage, meaning that you had the ability to work with genetically modified organisms. Are these types of DIY lab spaces typically where you work, or what does that look like?
I actually really enjoy the act of creating the lab space or the creative space itself. Not to get too philosophical and all that, but Michel Foucault had this great idea of the heterotopia. So he talks about it like in terms of brothels or ships or gardens, that create kind of spaces of difference. So something that can only be preserved and kept alive within that bottle or that contained space. So I tend to create these sort of heterotopias that he talks about for myself, create spaces where the kind of work that I do are only really possible in that specific space. I love creating community labs where the kind of interactions between different individuals in the community can only happen there. So where I do the work can be varied. Sometimes I have amazing colleagues with scientific labs that give me a position of standing in those labs where I can do certain things that I would not be able to do in my home lab, or vice versa in the community lab. But I love creating these spaces because it enables new kinds of interactions and practices and methods and new ways of engaging with science, art, or any other kind of practice.
So let's talk about your educational and academic background here, because it's a pretty extensive list. And
Oh,
as you
God.
mentioned, you are now Dr. Hastings after completing your PhD. So congratulations on that, first of all.
Thanks.
And in addition, you are a graduate of NYU and Harvard, Oxford, and Central St. Martin's with advanced degrees in biology, fine art, and bioinformatics. And I believe you're currently a fellow in the Graduate School of Medical Sciences at Cornell University. And you've attended a wide variety of programs at some of the best institutions, which is definitely admirable. But I think a question that a lot of people have is why? Is there an end goal of this continued education or something you're trying to reach? Or is this just based on interests and wanting to learn more?
Look, I enjoy kind of working through the inside. There are some, and I love sometimes working from the outside, but I also enjoy changing by changing the internal structure. So I guess my way of subversion is to at least be able to pass enough to be recognized as an insider. So I've got the provenance, as I like to say, in both startup culture as well as academia. I have the provenance of a, legitimate scientist. But I also like queering and subverting the assumptions. So when I walk into, say, DEF CON, someone might look at me as a suit. I'll dress up. I probably look like your mom or your sister or your aunt. And then I step on the stage and start giving a talk. So I kind of enjoy that position of being recognized as someone who might be considered part of the establishment or institution, but then in practice doesn't quite satisfy or uphold it in the same way.
And in addition to all of that, you are an analog astronaut, meaning that you participate in simulated space missions here on Earth, in which you live and work just as you would on the surface of another world. And I believe the first of these you participated in was Lunaris, which you served as a bioengineering mission specialist at a simulated lunar base at a former military installation in Poland. First of all, how did you get involved with this?
Yeah, so I was asked by a fellow artist, Dr. Sarah Jane Pell, who was leading up a mission at Lunaris back in 2018 to join her crew. And then I kind of fell in love with that act of going into a simulation, sort of suspending Earth reality for a bit and choosing to go into that hermetically sealed simulation space and figure out what was necessary in order to make that scenario of living off Earth possible. And what I discovered, very surprisingly, is being a hacker and someone who's very self-reliant, who is used to making do with whatever is available, was quite conducive to it. So being an analog astronaut, and hopefully one day actual astronaut that leaves Earth, being a hacker, I think, has informed my ability to be resilient in these environments.
So can you describe what these missions are? What's the goal and what were you working on during them?
Yeah, so space agencies like NASA and ESA run some of these missions, and I work with some of these partners to do tech readiness assessment. So that's some of the primary motivation for going into these analog spaces, is to do readiness assessment for actually going on further missions. These sorts of missions can be run in places like Antarctica, the high Arctic, size of a volcano, sometimes internal spaces like you have at Roscosmos just outside of Moscow for what was called the Mars 500, where they did a full-on Mars mission simulation with a crew of 5 for 500 days. That was extraordinary. So analog or space simulation missions are used to test assumptions, including the human crew. See how crew dynamics might shift, what's necessary in order to keep them healthy and functioning well, productive, and able to carry out the mission. So it really depends on the mission parameters that you set up before the simulation. Most of the ones that I do are about 2 weeks in duration, but I'm working on plans for much longer missions in the future.
And you were also commander on Sensoria Mission 1, which was a simulated Mars base experience at high seas where you essentially lived on a Hawaiian volcano with an all-female crew. How did you end up as commander of this mission, and what was the focus of this one?
So funny enough, that one singular mission that I started to organize in around February or March of 2019 turned into an entire program, the Sensoria program, that is already running multiple missions and will continue to run multiple 2-week missions for anyone that would like to push themselves and maybe work on research within these analog habitats, both high seas and lunaris. Those 2 weeks at the top of Mauna Loa with my amazing crew were splendid. I mean, even though 8 days out of the 14 were in low power conditions, we had horribly overcast skies, so no solar power coming in, no charge on our batteries, meant no real sort of standard of living within the habitat, but yet we found that we enjoyed just that camaraderie that was built, that silliness that we started experiencing in those 2 weeks. and a real focus on crew cohesion over maybe specific tasks that most missions might focus on.
So I know you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that you are an extremophile. I imagine you would be up for an actual trip to Mars or the moon or beyond. Is that something that you would like to one day do?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I would definitely depend on the circumstances of the mission itself. We do need to match mission with crew. That's something that anyone who's experienced these analog missions would tell you. You really do need to find the appropriate crew for the mission and vice versa. So I am 100% on board for going to live on the moon or live on the ISS or whatever other future space station. Mars is a different scenario altogether. That's more of a marathon than a sprint. Moon is a bit more of a settlement scenario, kind of like living on Antarctica, which I love. I would live in Antarctica if I could. But Mars is a very different. I think we're overstating our abilities at the moment to survive on Mars. I think it's entirely within our abilities to live on Mars long term. But currently, I think we're overstating our ability.
You've already done so many different things, so I'm kind of nervous to ask because who knows what the answer might be. But what's next for you? What are you working on now, and what do you have planned for the future?
So at the moment, I'm diving straight into my fellowship here at Cornell. So I'm at the School of Medicine. We do a bit of microbiology for space, extreme environments, as well as the COVID-19 research effort. So a bit of a lot of different things going on in the lab right now. Have future missions at high seas and lunars coming up. So more space missions and more artwork. So you can expect more of these crazy art science experiments that use my body to create all sorts of stuff. So some of everything, but for the immediate future, really concerned with what I can do in terms of microbiology and the environment. So focusing on microbiology ecologies.
So we've mentioned a lot of different things here. Your art, your community biospaces, the analog space missions, and I'll put links to all of those in the show notes. But if people want to find out more about you or follow along with what you're doing, is there somewhere online you'd send them?
Yeah, I guess I'd send them to my website, so jadenhastings.com, which is woefully behind. I need to find some time to actually update my public profile. Otherwise, you can follow along on social media at Hacker Astro. That tends to be my public face of what I've been up to, including some of my adventures in Antarctica, up on the volcano, down in the lava tubes, all that fun stuff. Otherwise, I love talking to and engaging with my fellow community biologists, biohackers, and other extremophiles online.
Great. I'll put links to everything we mentioned in the show notes at futuregrind.org. JJ, thank you again for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate it.
Hey everyone, Ryan O'Shea again, and thanks for listening to my interview with JJ. Remember to check out the show notes and more at futuregrind.org. Make sure to subscribe, leave us a review, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. We also need your help to keep this podcast going. You can donate at futuregrind.org/support or make a purchase at futuregrind.org/store. Till next time, this is Future Grind.